So this lecture is going to talk about the first half of chapter 3, and really we're going to talk mostly about defining and also how we measure variables. So in social sciences, often the things we study are hard to define things. They're things that are not objectively measurable, and so we have to think carefully about how we measure them and why we measure them in that way. So the first step in a research project is to find those unanswered questions and your research ideas. The second step, remember, is forming a hypothesis, which is a tentative answer to a question. And then we use our hypothesis to develop an empirical research study to support or refute the hypothesis. And sometimes we have a very well-defined and easy to observe variables, but often what we see in social sciences is a little harder to quantify. So in this third step, we're working on determining a method for defining and measuring the variable being studied. And so we want to make sure that the variables we're assessing are well-defined and they're easy to observe and easy to measure. And so variables can be a characteristic or condition that can change or have different values for different individuals. So examples of variables are things like height and weight, which are objective and easy to measure. But we also often are more likely to study in psychology those kind of intangible abstract attributes, things like someone's motivation or self-esteem. And when we're looking at these kind of abstract things, measurement gets much more complicated. So one thing that kind of helps frame how we address this is our theories and our constructs. So a theory helps organize and unify observations about a behavior in relationship to other variables. So a theory is a set of statements about a mechanism underlying a particular behavior. So it should help generate predictions about a behavior. The constructs, sometimes these are called hypothetical constructs, are the attributes or the mechanisms that explain or predict behavior. So the concept is kind of the idea in psychological theories to explain whatever behavior or mental process we're studying. So constructs are hypothetical entities, and they are really created from theory or speculation. They cannot be seen, but we assume that they exist, and they can help explain and predict behavior in a theory. So some of the kinds of constructs that we study that are kind of abstract, we can't see them, but we assume they exist, are things like aggression, depression, memory, stress, well-being. All the things we study in psychology are these constructs that we can't actually see them, but we've experienced them, we've watched someone else experience them, we believe that they exist. So we have these hypothetical constructs, and we have to figure out how are we going to measure them. So sometimes this is called operationalizing a construct. Our operational definition is a method for defining and measuring a construct. And particularly, we have to develop an operational definition for a variable that cannot be observed or measured directly. An operational definition, again, is how we measure this. So an example is intelligence. Okay, so intelligence in and of itself is an abstract construct that we cannot directly measure, but we might define intelligence as a score, somebody's score on an IQ test. Hunger is something that we may have personally experienced, but you can't objectively measure it, but maybe we operationally define hunger as the number of hours of food deprivation. And these operational definitions can have a big impact on the study because there may be different operational definitions of the same construct. So for example, if I'm studying aggression, I might measure how many times a child pushes another child to the ground. Or in like the Milgram experiments, they looked at how high someone would go when they believed they were electrocuting another participant or another person. So this operational definition is often how we measure a variable. It might also be how we manipulate it in an experiment. So a construct, kind of getting these two, identifying these two things and separating them is very important. A construct is generally what we're really interested in, the phenomenon that we believe is real, but it's intangible. You can't touch it or see it, but we try to measure it. Operational definition is how we go about measuring that hypothetical construct. So if we were interested in doing a study on sexual jealousy, we believe it exists. We might have personally experienced it, but you can't physically see or touch it. So that would be our construct. And our operational definition might be someone's response to a hypothetical situation about infidelity. And we might measure that response in terms of heart rate or their facial expressions. But again, the thing to remember is that different operational definitions will have different results. So that construct is a general phenomenon we're studying, and the operational definition is how we measure that construct. So I'd encourage you to just pause right here and take a second to practice this and think about how those constructs, those operational definitions might line up to the construct, and see if you can identify which operational definition goes with which construct. Now, there are some limits to operational definition, and one of the big ones is to always remember that an operational definition is not the same as the construct itself. So when we're measuring or creating an operational definition, we're measuring the external manifestation of a construct. So we're measuring the external manifestation of anxiety, and that's not the same as directly measuring the anxiety itself. There's also concerns about the quality of operational definitions and the measurements that are produced. So there is potentially a limitless number of operational definitions for any single construct. And some of these operational definitions may be meaningless. So this is one, kind of how much meaning, the validity of a given operational definitions. And it's really easy for operational definitions to leave out important components of a construct. Likewise, or conversely, operational definitions could also exclude extra components or include extra or additional components that are not part of the construct being measured. So we have to kind of think about that. So again, if we go back to that aggression example, if all we know about aggression is the number of bullying acts, these implications, if that's the operational definition, the implications would be different than if we were measuring aggression through verbal assault. So if we're looking at physical aggression versus verbal aggression, those have different implications. And it gets to a point where you need to think carefully about if we don't have kind of a clear operational definition. So intelligence is one where we have kind of a pretty clear, well-accepted definition, operational definition, which is one of those standardized IQ tests like the Wechsler scale. We can create it, but is it really a high quality operational definition? So when we use operational definitions, one of the things that we want to do is, one of the first things we want to do is consult previous research to determine the best way to measure a variable. So yes, we can make up these operational definitions, but if there is already a standardized measure for the construct that you're studying, it's much better to use that standardized and well-accepted measure than to go through and create one of your own that you don't know how good it is. So if we use the conventional way of measuring a variable, it gets us a standardized and well-tested measure of your variable. It also allows you to compare your results to previous studies. So if you're looking at something like depression and that's your construct, maybe you operationally define that as somebody's score on the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a well-accepted scale for depression. And so maybe if you look at the number of depressive symptoms or the depression score on the BDI, if you're looking at depression among non-traditional college students, then you can, and you use that standardized scale, you can directly compare that to somebody else who studied traditional college students and see how consistent it is. So having these kind of conventional ways of measuring an operational or a construct gives you a huge advantage. Now for your projects, most likely you will have to write the questions yourself. So you'll have selected your constructs and need to come up with your own operational definition. But I will show you a tool that you might consider using, which is PsycTests, which is basically a database full of psychological tests. And so this is one way that you might have access to a more conventional way of measuring your construct.